The Oklahoma sun was a brutal, unforgiving thing, baking the red earth of Fort Sill until it cracked and turned to dust. The air shimmered with heat, and the constant hum of insects was the only sound that could compete with the roar of the M109 Paladin. For Sergeant Anya Petrova, this was the sound of home. It was the sound of a purpose, a thunderous heartbeat that she understood better than anything else in the world. Anya was new to the 1st Battalion, a place that held itself with an air of proud, dusty tradition. Their motto, carved in stone above the mess hall door, was Instant Thunder. It was a reference to a long-ago famous artillery strike, a moment of perfect timing and overwhelming force. But the men in this unit seemed to believe they were still living in that past. The old ways were the only ways, and they looked at the world and at Anya with a kind of stubborn, narrow focus. Anya was different. She had a mind like a computer and a feel for the rhythm of the cannons that was almost spiritual. She could look at a map, feel the slope of the land in her bones, and come up with a firing solution that was more precise than any algorithm. But her mind was the only thing they cared about. And in their eyes, her gender made her a weak, unpredictable thing. From the moment she arrived, they had called her Phoenix, not because of her strength, or her ability to rise from the ashes, as some might think. No, they meant it to be an insult. The little bird, they'd sneered, a small, delicate thing that didn't belong in the violent, messy business of war. She'd heard it all before, but she kept her face as calm and still as a summer pond. She knew her worth. They would learn it too. Her biggest problem wore the shiny bars of a 1st lieutenant. Lieutenant Granger was a man of impressive stature and even more impressive arrogance. He spoke loudly with a confidence that hid a deep well of insecurity. He saw Anya not as a soldier, but as a challenge to his authority, a piece of equipment that needed to be put in its place. He ignored her ideas and her firing solutions, even when they were clearly better than his own. He would nod with a fake smile when she spoke, then dismiss her with a wave of his hand. It was a silent battle of wills, and for now, he was winning. Today, the battle was a live fire exercise, the biggest training event of the year. The unit had been tasked with a complex scenario. They had to hit a series of targets miles away, moving from one position to the next with precision. It was the kind of challenge that made Anya's mind sing. She had studied the terrain, the wind patterns, the very texture of the air. She knew the exact angle, the perfect charge, the moment the cannon should fire to make the round land exactly where it needed to be. "My solution is better, sir," she said to Granger, her voice low and steady. "The wind is shifting. The old formula won't account for it." Granger just smiled, a cruel, tight-lipped thing. "Don't you worry your pretty little head about it, Phoenix. We'll stick to the book. The old way worked just fine for the men who built this place. It'll work for us," he gave the order. The cannon thundered, a violent, deafening cough that shook the ground. Anya watched, her heart a heavy stone in her chest. She saw the dust kick up far to the right of the target. A mist stopped Granger's face went white, then red. He swore under his breath and ordered a second round, then a third, each one a little closer, but none a direct hit. The failure horn blared, a long, mocking sound that echoed across the field. The official report blamed a technical error, but everyone knew the truth. Granger had failed. In front of the entire battalion, he tried to put the blame on Anya, saying she had been a distraction, that her fussy questions had made him second-guess himself. It was a lie, a cruel, cowardly lie. Anya stood straight, her chin held high, as the men of the battalion looked at her with a mix of pity and contempt. They had a new nickname for her now, one that was whispered with a bitter sneer: the Jinx. She felt a hot, burning anger rise in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She would not let them see her break. She would not let them win. She walked away from the field, leaving the dust and the mockery behind. She was a phoenix, they had said, and it was true, but they had not yet seen her rise. The failure horn's blare was a sound that haunted Anya. It echoed in her dreams, a shrill, mocking note that followed her from the dusty training field to the cold, silent quiet of her barracks room. She had known the shot would be a miss. She had seen it in the shifting dust, felt it in the subtle change of the air. But she was not in command. Lieutenant Granger was, and his arrogance was a heavy weight on everyone's shoulders. Now she was the Jinx, a whispered name that followed her like a shadow. She ate alone in the mess hall. The men who had once shared a laugh with her now kept their distance, their eyes on the floor or the wall, anywhere but on her. They were good men, most of them, soldiers who believed in honor and justice. But they also believed in an old, stubborn way of thinking, and a jinx was a jinx. It was easier to blame her than to question their lieutenant, a man who represented their traditions. Anya felt a loneliness that was different from being alone. It was a cold, empty feeling, like walking through a desert in a thick fog. Her family, her memories, and her home in the suburbs of Virginia felt a million miles away, a life she had to leave behind to find her place in the world. She had chosen this life. She had wanted to serve. But for the first time, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. She thought back to a time when her instincts had mattered, when a man had trusted her. It wasn't here at Fort Sill, but during a training mission at a military base in Kentucky. A group of recruits had gone missing during a mock search and rescue mission. A fierce thunderstorm had rolled in, turning the low-lying hills into a dangerous maze of rushing water and slippery mud. The search team was out of its depth, and they were losing time. Anya was a gunner then, not yet a sergeant, and she wasn't even part of the search team. But she had been listening to the radio chatter, looking at the maps and the weather reports with a focused, almost obsessive intensity. Anya had a feeling, a deep, unsettling certainty that something was wrong. She saw a tiny creek on the map, a place no one else was paying attention to. The storm had turned that creek into a raging river, and she knew in her gut that the recruits would have taken the wrong turn to avoid the storm. She walked up to the commanding officer, a grizzled old major who had seen it all. "Sir, they're not on the northern path," she said, her voice trembling just a little. "They're downstream, near the creek. The storm pushed them there." The major looked at her, then at the map. He scoffed. "And how would a gunner know that, Private?" "My calculations, sir," she said, her voice steady now, "based on the wind and the flash flood potential. They're in danger." He just shook his head and waved her off. He had his own plan, a plan that had worked for 100 years. He wasn't going to let a young soldier change it, but Anya couldn't let it go. She took a risk, a big one. She left her post, grabbed a small radio and a flare gun, and ran into the storm. She followed her gut, her instincts, her feeling. She scrambled through the mud and the rushing water, her heart pounding in her chest like a drum. She found them, huddled under a large tree, shivering and scared. One of the recruits had a broken ankle and couldn't walk. Anya didn't have time to think. She used her radio to call for help, gave them a new, more precise location, and then, without hesitation, she used the last of her strength to carry the injured recruit on her back through the mud and water until help arrived. She made it just in time, but the effort had nearly cost her everything. She had been exhausted, cold, and alone in the woods with no one to help her. She had gotten in trouble for leaving her post, but she had saved a life. It was a trade she would make every time. Now, back in the present at Fort Sill, a new real-world mission had been assigned to the 1st Battalion. The men were to deploy to a small, dusty town in the desert of a Middle Eastern country, a place where a small, stubborn group of terrorists had dug in. This wasn't a training exercise anymore. This was real. Anya's unit was given the task of providing artillery support for the ground troops. Their mission was to hit 3 specific targets, one after the other, with precision. Granger, of course, was in charge. He had a plan, a simple plan that everyone in the battalion had used for years. It was a good plan for a simple battlefield. But this place was different. The terrain was treacherous, the targets were hidden, and the wind was a wild, unpredictable beast. Anya spoke up in the briefing. "Lieutenant, with all due respect, the wind in that valley changes direction every 10 minutes. We need to adjust our firing solution for each shot." Granger just looked at her, his eyes cold and hard. He didn't even bother to hide his contempt. "Phoenix," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "we have our orders. We'll stick to the plan. There will be no adjustments and no time for them. Your job is to fire when I tell you to fire. Nothing more." Anya's heart sank. She knew what this meant. He was so afraid of another failure that he was willing to ignore the changing conditions. He was willing to risk the lives of the men on the ground to save his own pride. The mission began, and for a while, everything seemed to be going according to Granger's plan. They moved into position, they aimed the Paladin, and they fired the first round, a perfect hit. The ground troops cheered and Granger smiled, a smug, satisfied smirk that made Anya sick to her stomach. She watched the dust settle and she waited. She knew the second round was going to be a problem. She watched the men on the ground moving toward the next target. They were exposed, walking into the open, believing that the next round would land in the right spot. But Anya could feel the wind shift. She watched the digital readout on her console, a small, quiet, and lonely voice telling her that Granger's plan was now useless. Granger gave the order to fire the second round. "Fire!" he yelled into the radio. Anya hesitated for a moment. Just a split second, a moment of doubt, a moment where she thought about her career, her future, and the consequences of disobeying a direct order. Then she thought about the soldiers on the ground, the good men who had turned their backs on her. They were still soldiers. They were still people. And she had a responsibility to them that was greater than her responsibility to Granger. She reached for the console and made a quick, decisive change. She adjusted the trajectory just a little, just enough to account for the shifting wind. She didn't have time for her usual precise calculations. She had to go on instinct. "She had to be a phoenix! What are you doing?" Granger yelled, his face turning a deep crimson. "I said fire!" Anya ignored him. She hit the button. The Paladin roared, a sound of overwhelming force, a sound that she had always loved. The round flew into the sky, a deadly metal bird on a silent, deadly journey. It landed, a perfect hit, right on the second target. The ground troops were safe. Anya felt a mix of relief and terror. She had disobeyed a direct order. She had saved lives, but she had broken the chain of command. She turned to look at Granger, whose face was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He didn't thank her. He didn't congratulate her. He just stared at her with a look of pure, cold hatred. He knew she had been right. He knew he had been wrong, and that was a truth he could not live with. He was a man who had to be in control. He would never admit that she was better than him, that she had a feel for the rhythm of the cannon that he would never understand. The mission was a success, but for Anya, the real battle had just begun. The silence in the unit was different now. It was no longer a silent contempt, but a silent awe. They had seen what she could do. They had seen her sacrifice. They had seen the Phoenix rise. But Granger still held the power. The path to redemption was long, and she was still the Jinx, with a powerful enemy now set against her. She was a Phoenix, but she had yet to face the fire. Lieutenant Granger's hatred for Anya was a living thing, a coiled serpent that hissed in the back of his mind. He couldn't shake the memory of her calm defiance, the moment she had disobeyed his order and in doing so had proven him wrong. He had been so sure of his calculations, so smug in his victory after the first shot landed perfectly. But then, as Anya had predicted, the wind had shifted, and his plan had become a trap. She had saved the mission, and in his eyes had stolen his honor. He would never forgive her. Anya felt the change in the air, a silent, tense shift that was more dangerous than the wind itself. The other soldiers in the unit now looked at her with a new kind of respect, a quiet nod or a simple, sincere smile. They knew the truth, and they had seen her courage. But Granger held the power. He had filed a formal report accusing Anya of insubordination and endangering the mission. Her act of saving lives was being twisted into a betrayal of command. Her days were now a monotonous, fearful rhythm of waiting. She performed her duties perfectly, her movements precise and efficient, but the tension was a constant weight on her shoulders. She knew the consequences of what she had done. A court-martial was likely, and with it, the end of her career. She had a choice to make. She could lie and say she had panicked, or she could tell the truth and hope for justice. She chose the truth. Anya's emotional strength was forged in a childhood of silent battles. Her father was a stern, distant man, a retired soldier who believed in duty and discipline above all else. He had seen her intelligence, her quick mind, and he had pushed her to be strong. But her mother was a different story, a gentle artist who had a way of seeing the world in shades of color and emotion. She had a nervous, fragile way about her, and she had raised Anya to be a peacemaker. Anya had learned to be strong on the outside and gentle on the inside. She had learned to sacrifice her own needs for the sake of others. Now, in this dusty, foreign land, she felt the ghosts of her past following her. She thought about her mother's quiet fears and her father's unyielding expectations. She had always walked a thin line between them, trying to be strong enough for her father and gentle enough for her mother. Now, that tightrope was a battlefield, and she had to choose which side to stand on. The next mission was a big one. The ground troops were advancing on a fortified building, a place where a high-level terrorist leader was thought to be hiding. The plan was simple. The artillery would fire on the building, creating a diversion that would allow the ground troops to enter and capture the target. The mission was a crucial one, and the eyes of the entire command were on the 1st Battalion. Granger was in his element. He was in command, and he had a simple, straightforward plan. He had chosen the angle of the shot, the charge of the round, and the exact moment to fire. He didn't consult with Anya or any of the other soldiers. He was the one in charge, and he would not be challenged. Anya was on the console, her fingers poised above the controls. She felt a deep, unsettling feeling in her gut. She looked at the map, at the terrain, at the subtle shifts in the air. The wind was a treacherous thing in this place, a wild beast that could change direction in an instant. She knew Granger's calculations were wrong. They were off by a degree, a tiny, insignificant fraction that could mean the difference between life and death. She opened her mouth to speak, but Granger cut her off. "Don't you dare," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "You have your orders, Sergeant." "Don't you forget who you are or where you stand." Anya bit her lip and said nothing. She knew the penalty for insubordination. She had already pushed the limit once, and she was already on the edge of a court-martial. But she also knew that if she followed his orders, the lives of the ground troops were at risk. The radio crackled. "Ground troops are in position, awaiting your mark." Granger's face was flushed with excitement. He had the power now, the power to make a difference. He raised his hand, a triumphant gesture. "Ready, fire!" he yelled into the radio. Anya's finger hovered over the fire button. She had to choose. She had to decide. She saw the ground troops moving into position, their faces tense and focused. They were good men, and they were trusting her unit to keep them safe. Granger looked at her, his eyes narrow and cruel. "What are you waiting for, Phoenix?" "Fire!" Anya took a deep breath. She had to make a choice, and she had to make it now. She closed her eyes for a split second, and she saw the faces of the recruits she had saved in the Kentucky storm. She saw the look of fear in their eyes, and she felt the weight of their lives on her back. She had to do something. But what? She couldn't disobey a direct order. She couldn't risk a court-martial. But she also couldn't sit back and watch as Granger's arrogance put lives at risk. Her mind raced, a blur of numbers and calculations, possibilities and probabilities. She saw a solution, a tiny impossible window of opportunity. It was a risky move, a gamble that could end in her disgrace or her redemption. But it was the only way. Granger was yelling now, his voice a wild panic shriek. "Fire! Fire, you useless woman!" Anya's hands moved not to the fire button, but to the console. She made a rapid, frantic change. She adjusted the trajectory, but not to hit the target. She adjusted it to land the round behind the building, to create a diversion that was bigger, more spectacular, and more convincing than the one Granger had planned. It was a bluff, a calculated risk, a way to save the ground troops without disobeying a direct order. She hit the fire button. The M109 Paladin roared, a thunderous roar that shook the earth. The round flew into the sky, a deadly metal bird on a silent, deadly journey. It didn't hit the building. It landed far behind it, a controlled blast that sent a massive cloud of dust and debris into the air. The ground troops, seeing the diversion, burst into action. They ran into the building, their movements fluid and coordinated. They found the terrorist leader and captured him without a single casualty. But Granger was not celebrating. He was staring at Anya, his eyes wide with shock and fury. "What did you do?" he said, his voice a choked whisper. "You missed the target. You disobeyed my order." "No, sir," Anya said, her voice steady now, her heart pounding. "I created a diversion. I saved the mission. I followed the rules of engagement. Granger was speechless. He had been so sure of his plan, so confident in his power. But Anya had outsmarted him. She had saved the mission, and in doing so, had exposed his arrogance and his cowardice. She was not a jinx. She was a phoenix, and she had just risen from the ashes. But the battle was not over. Granger had a direct line to the top command, and he would not rest until she was broken. She had to get to the truth first. The quiet after the mission was more deafening than any explosion. The air was thick with the unsaid, a heavy blanket of dread and anticipation. Lieutenant Granger, his face a mask of silent rage, had returned to base and immediately filed a formal complaint. He accused Anya of a reckless act of insubordination, of a willful disregard for the command, and of endangering the lives of the ground troops by failing to hit the designated target. He twisted the truth, molding it into a version where he was the wronged hero and Anya was the villain. Anya knew what was coming. The official inquiry, the interviews, the formal hearing. She was a soldier, and she had disobeyed a direct order. The rules were clear, but she had also saved lives. She had followed her instincts and her heart, and she had done the right thing. It was a choice between her career and her conscience, and she had chosen her conscience. The military police came for her, and she was brought to a small, windowless office for questioning. A stern-faced major sat across from her, his eyes cold and unblinking. He read her the charges, his voice a flat, emotionless drone. Anya listened, her heart a steady drum against her ribs. She was not a criminal. She was a soldier. She had nothing to hide. She told her story, calmly and honestly. She explained her calculations, the wind's sudden treacherous shift, and Granger's refusal to listen. She described the terrible feeling in her gut, the way she had seen the ground troops moving into the open, a target for an unseen enemy. She explained how she had made a choice, a split-second decision to create a diversion, a controlled blast that would save them. The major wrote it all down, his pen scratching against the paper, his face still a stone. Granger was interviewed next. He had a different story, of course. He talked about his years of experience, his perfect record, and his devotion to duty. He spoke of Anya as a reckless, emotional woman, a soldier who had a personal vendetta against him. He claimed she had a history of insubordination and that she was a danger to the unit. He was a master of manipulation, and he painted a picture of a brave commander betrayed by a weak and emotional soldier. The inquiry went on for days. Anya was confined to the barracks, a prisoner in her own world. The other soldiers now looked at her with a new kind of sympathy, a silent respect that was more powerful than any spoken words. They had seen what she had done, and they had seen Granger's cowardly betrayal. They wanted to speak up, to tell the truth, but they were afraid. Granger was a powerful man, and they were just soldiers. But one man had a different kind of courage. His name was Sergeant Jones, and he had been a witness to the whole thing. He was a quiet, unassuming man who had a reputation for being a great soldier, but a terrible liar. He had seen the whole thing, the tension between Anya and Granger, the way Granger had ignored her warnings, and the way Anya had acted, a split-second decision that had saved everyone. He was called in for questioning, and he was asked to choose a side. He had to decide if he was going to tell the truth and face the wrath of his superior, or if he was going to lie and betray a good soldier. He thought about his wife and his kids back home. He thought about the men in his unit, the good men who had turned their backs on Anya. He thought about the day she had saved them. He made a choice. Anya was in her barracks room when she heard the news. Sergeant Jones had told the truth. He had stood up to Granger, and he had told the inquiry everything he had seen. He had described the tension in the air, the wind's sudden shift, and Anya's brave, selfless act. He had said that if Anya had followed Granger's order, the ground troops would have been killed. It was a stunning act of courage, and it changed everything. The inquiry was now a battle between two men, a battle for the truth. Granger had his story, a story of a brave commander and a reckless soldier. Jones had his story, a story of a brave soldier and a cowardly commander. The truth was somewhere in between, but the evidence was now on Anya's side. The final hearing was a tense, dramatic affair. The room was small and airless, filled with high-ranking officers and the silent, watchful faces of the soldiers who had witnessed the event. Anya sat in a chair, her back straight, her hands clasped in her lap. She felt a deep, quiet resolve. She was not afraid. She had done the right thing, and she would not apologize for it. Granger was called to the stand first. He spoke with a practiced ease, his voice a confident, arrogant rumble. He repeated his story, twisting the facts, painting Anya as a reckless, insubordinate soldier who was a danger to the unit. He was a good liar, and his words were a poison, a slow, steady drip of venom that could destroy a person's life. Then, it was Anya's turn. She was asked to tell her story. She spoke in a quiet, steady voice, her words clear and precise. She did not raise her voice. She did not show any emotion. She simply told the truth, the raw, unvarnished truth of what had happened. She talked about the wind, the numbers, the lives of the soldiers. She talked about her choice. The officers listened, their faces unreadable. They had heard both sides of the story, and now they had to make a choice. They had to decide who to believe. They had to decide what was more important, the chain of command or the lives of the soldiers. The future of a good soldier was in their hands, and they had to make a decision. The hearing was adjourned. The room was silent. Anya stood and walked out of the room, her head held high. She had done all she could. She had told the truth, and she had stood her ground. Now all she could do was wait. Her fate was in the hands of the officers, but in her heart she was a phoenix. She had not yet risen, but she had not yet fallen. The silence that followed the hearing was a heavy, living thing. It was more difficult to bear than any shouting, more nerve-wracking than any battle. Anya returned to her barracks room and sat on her bed, her mind as still as the desert air outside. She had done all she could. She had told the truth, and she had stood her ground. Her fate was no longer in her hands. A day passed, then another. The suspense was a slow, crushing weight. The other soldiers would glance at her, a look of respect mixed with a quiet pity in their eyes. They knew her story, and they knew the injustice of it all. But they were helpless, caught in the web of military rules and regulations. Finally, on the morning of the third day, a messenger came for her. "Sergeant Petrova," he said, his voice flat. "You are to report to the command post immediately." Anya's heart gave a single hard thump against her ribs. This was it, the moment of truth. She took a deep breath, straightened her uniform, and followed the messenger. The command post was a small, bustling building filled with the low hum of electronics and the sharp smell of coffee. The room was tense, the air thick with unspoken words. The same stern-faced major from the hearing was there, along with two other high-ranking officers. And there, standing in a corner, his face pale and his eyes a cold, glassy blue, was Lieutenant Granger. He looked like a man who had been caught in a lie. The major cleared his throat. "Sergeant Petrova, we have reached a verdict in the matter of your insubordination." He paused, and the silence stretched on forever. "After a thorough review of the evidence, including the testimony of Sergeant Jones, we have determined that your actions, while a technical breach of the chain of command, were justified. Your swift, decisive action saved the lives of the ground troops. The charges against you have been dropped." Anya felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost knocked her to her knees. She had been right. Justice had prevailed. Her reputation, her career, her honor, all of it was restored. She stood tall, her head held high. The major's gaze then shifted to Granger. "Lieutenant Granger," he said, his voice now a hard, sharp edge, "your actions in this matter were a grave dereliction of duty. Your refusal to acknowledge the changing conditions, your arrogance in the face of expert advice, and your deliberate attempt to mislead this inquiry are all unacceptable. You have been relieved of your command and will be reassigned immediately. The military does not tolerate cowardice or deceit. You are dismissed." Granger's face turned a sickly shade of green. His carefully constructed world had just shattered. He didn't look at Anya. He just turned and walked out of the room, a broken man. Anya felt a quiet, deep satisfaction. It wasn't revenge, but it was justice. The truth had finally come out, and the liar had been exposed. But the day was not over. The major looked at Anya again, a new expression in his eyes. It was a look of respect, a quiet acknowledgement of her strength. Sergeant Petrova, a new critical mission has been assigned to our unit. The target is a highly fortified enemy stronghold, a place where a dangerous terrorist group has dug in. The ground troops are pinned down and they can't get out. We need a way to hit them with overwhelming force, to create a diversion that will give our men a chance to retreat. The plan needs to be perfect because there is no room for error. He then looked at her, his eyes serious. This is your chance. We need a new kind of attack, a new way of thinking. What do you suggest? Anya felt a surge of adrenaline, a rush of pure, focused energy. She walked to the large map on the wall, her mind already working, her fingers tracing the lines of the terrain, the hills, the valleys, the hidden places where the enemy could be hiding. She saw a solution, a plan that was so crazy, so audacious, that it might just work. It was a plan that no one had ever attempted before. "Sir," she said, her voice confident and clear, "we can hit them. We can hit them from all sides, all at once. We need to fire a volley of rounds, a massive, overwhelming barrage. The enemy won't have time to react, to adjust, to find cover. It will be so fast, so sudden, so deafening that it will sound like the end of the world. It will be instant thunder. They will have no escape." The officers looked at each other, their faces a mix of shock and awe. The plan was a massive risk, a gamble that could end in disaster. But they had seen her in action. They had heard her story. They had seen her strength, her instincts, her calm, and her sacrifice. They trusted her. "Sergeant," the major said, a thin, satisfied smile on his face, "get to it. The lives of our men are in your hands." Anya moved to the Paladin, her home, her partner in the war. She felt a sense of peace, a quiet calm that she had not felt in months. She was no longer an outcast. She was no longer a jinx. She was a soldier, a leader, and she was in control. She gave the orders, her voice a steady, confident rhythm. The other soldiers in the unit, the men who had once looked at her with contempt, now looked at her with pure, unadulterated respect. They moved with a new sense of purpose, a quiet, focused energy. The M109 Paladin was now her instrument, a powerful and deadly machine that she would use to protect her men. She hit the button and the Paladin roared, a sound that shook the earth, a sound that she had always loved. The round flew into the sky, a deadly metal bird on a silent, deadly journey. Another one followed, and another and another. A wave of thunderous sound, a cascade of fire and steel that rained down on the enemy stronghold. It was a beautiful and terrible thing to witness. Anya watched the screens, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and excitement. She watched as the enemy stronghold was ripped apart by the instant thunder. She watched as the ground troops, seeing their chance, began to move, their movements fluid and coordinated. They were safe. They were free. The mission was a stunning success. Not a single man had been lost. When Anya returned to the base, the soldiers were there, waiting for her. They didn't cheer or applaud. They just looked at her, their eyes filled with a new kind of respect. Sergeant Jones was there, and he gave her a quiet, knowing nod. Anya's eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of gratitude. She was not a jinx. She was not a reckless soldier. She was a hero. She had risen from the ashes, and she was stronger than ever. She had found her place, her purpose, and she had found justice. Her journey was over, and it had ended with a powerful, satisfying roar of instant thunder.